Behind the golden gates of Kensington
We need
Palace,
to make a
where
decision
photographers
soon.
wait endlessly
The
for the
longer we
perfect
wait, the more
shot and the world
complicated it
watches every
becomes.
smile, every
We must
gesture,
remain
every
united
carefully
in the
chosen
face of
outfit.
these
A
challenges.
different story unfolds. It's a story that tabloids can only guess at, where the weight of a 1,000-year-old crown meets the very human struggles of marriage, parenthood, and finding your place in a world that never stops watching. Catherine stood at her bedroom window that cold February morning in 26, watching the early morning joggers in Hyde Park, their breath visible in small clouds as they moved through the frost-covered paths. From this distance, they looked free. She touched the glass, feeling its coldness against her fingertips, and wondered what it would be like to simply put on trainers and run until her legs gave out, with no security detail, no schedule, no carefully planned route approved by protection officers. Behind her, William was already reviewing briefing papers for the day ahead, his coffee growing cold as he concentrated on reports that would shape his responses to questions he hadn't yet been asked. The morning light caught the subtle lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, lines that spoke of responsibility accepted perhaps too young, of decisions that affected millions, of a life lived under constant scrutiny. Neither of them spoke about the elephant in the room, the growing tension that seemed to follow them everywhere lately, the whispered conversations between staff members who thought they weren't listening, the way certain topics had become off-limits in their own home. They had weathered storms before, survived scandals and criticism and the endless appetite of a media machine that never slept. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that threatened not just their public image, but the very foundation of everything they had built together. What happens when the fairy tale begins to crack? When the prince and princess, beloved by millions, discover that love alone isn't enough to navigate the treacherous waters of modern monarchy? When private struggles threaten to become public spectacles, and every decision carries consequences that ripple far beyond their own lives? This is their story, not the one you see in official portraits or carefully staged public appearances, but the real story of two people trying to hold their world together while the ground shifts beneath their feet. Catherine Middleton, now the Princess of Wales, had learned many things in her years as a royal wife that no finishing school or etiquette class could have taught her. She had learned to smile when her feet ached from standing in heels for hours during state visits. She had learned to make small talk about charities and weather, while mentally calculating how many minutes remained until she could escape to the car. She had learned to ignore the camera flashes that seemed to follow her everywhere, turning even a simple trip to the school pickup into a carefully choreographed performance. But nothing had prepared her for the particular challenge she faced this February morning, as she sat across from her private secretary, Amanda Richardson, in the small sitting room that had become their unofficial crisis management center. Amanda was typically composed, her silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon, her expression carefully neutral as she delivered news that would have sent most people into a panic. "The American tabloids are planning something significant," Amanda said, her voice measured and professional despite the gravity of her words. "Our contacts in New York have confirmed that they've been conducting interviews with former palace staff members, people who left service under various circumstances over the past 3 years." Catherine felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression steady. Years of royal training had taught her to never let her emotions show in moments like these. "What kind of interviews?" "The usual sensationalized nonsense, I'm afraid. Claims about tensions in your marriage, suggestions that William is under enormous pressure from his father regarding the direction of the monarchy, implications that you're struggling with the demands of royal life." Amanda paused, her fingers drumming once against the leather portfolio in her lap. "There's also talk of publishing private text messages allegedly sent between you and staff members." The mention of private messages made Catherine's breath catch slightly. She thought of all the casual conversations she'd had with various staff members over the years, the moments of frustration or exhaustion she'd shared thinking they were confidential. The idea of those moments being twisted and presented to millions of readers as evidence of some larger narrative made her feel exposed in a way that went beyond anything she'd experienced before. "How private are we talking?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "They claim to have messages where you express frustration about certain royal protocols, conversations about George's education that they're trying to frame as disagreements between you and William, and something about your mother's involvement in family decisions that they're presenting as interference." Catherine closed her eyes briefly, remembering the text she'd sent to her former lady-in-waiting 6 months ago when she'd been overwhelmed by criticism over Charlotte's school choice. She'd written something about feeling like she couldn't win no matter what decisions they made, that every choice was scrutinized and judged by people who had never walked in her shoes. At the time, it had felt like harmless venting to someone she trusted. Now it could become a headline suggesting she was cracking under pressure. "What's our legal position?" she asked. "Complicated," Amanda replied honestly. "The messages, if they exist, were sent to personal phones rather than official palace devices, which makes it harder to claim they were obtained illegally. And the former staff members are technically free to share their experiences, even if we find their characterizations unfair or incomplete. Catherine walked to the window, looking out at the tourists gathered beyond the palace gates. They held their phones high, hoping to catch a glimpse of royal life, completely unaware that the woman they might be trying to photograph was dealing with the very human fear of having her private thoughts exposed to the world. "There's something else," Amanda continued, and Catherine could hear the reluctance in her voice. "They've also been speaking to people from your university days, flatmates, professors, people who knew you before you met William." This was somehow worse than the staff situation. Catherine had worked hard to build walls between her pre-royal life and her current existence, partly to protect the people she'd known then from unwanted attention. The idea of old friends being approached by tabloid journalists, possibly being offered money for stories about her, felt like a betrayal she hadn't anticipated. "What are they looking for exactly?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "The usual narrative, that you were ambitious from the start, that the relationship was calculated, that you changed fundamentally after the marriage. They want to paint a picture of transformation that suggests your current struggles are inevitable consequences of choices you made years ago." Catherine thought about her university years, the girl she'd been then. She remembered staying up late studying, working part-time jobs to help with expenses despite her family's comfortable financial situation, dating William when he was just another student struggling with his coursework and his future. The simplicity of that time seemed almost impossible now, like a story someone else had told her rather than memories she'd lived. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. William entered, still wearing his riding clothes from his morning exercise. His hair slightly disheveled and his cheeks reddened from the cold air. He looked between Catherine and Amanda, immediately reading the tension in the room. "What's happened now?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Catherine's. Amanda repeated the information about the tabloid investigation, and Catherine watched William's expression grow increasingly grim as he processed the implications. She had seen this look before, during previous media storms, but something about his reaction today felt different. There was a weariness in his eyes that went beyond simple frustration with invasive journalism. "This is about more than just sensational stories," William said finally. "They're trying to build a case that we're fundamentally unsuited for our roles, that the institution itself is unstable because of our personal issues." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. She understood what he meant. The monarchy's survival depended on public support and confidence. Stories that painted them as a dysfunctional couple dealing with irreconcilable differences didn't just threaten their privacy, they threatened the very foundation of the system they represented. "How much of this is true, though?" Catherine asked quietly. Not the sensationalized version, but the underlying concerns they're exploiting. William looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw the same questions that had been keeping her awake lately. Were they struggling more than they should be? Had the pressures of royal life created distance between them that hadn't existed before? Were they setting a good example for their children? Or were George, Charlotte, and Louis growing up in a household where duty and obligation had begun to overshadow love and spontaneity? "We're handling everything the best way we know how," William said, but his voice lacked the conviction she wished she could hear. Amanda cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps this is an opportunity to get ahead of the narrative. We could arrange some positive coverage, more informal interviews where you both discuss your partnership and shared goals." Catherine and William exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their current relationship dynamics. The idea of sitting for interviews where they would be expected to project unity and happiness when they were privately grappling with so many uncertainties felt exhausting rather than appealing. "Let me think about it," William said, which Catherine knew was his polite way of saying no. After Amanda left, Catherine and William sat in silence for several minutes. The morning sun had grown stronger, casting long shadows across the ornate carpet, and Catherine found herself studying the patterns as if they might hold answers to questions she wasn't sure how to ask. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd never met?" Catherine asked finally. William turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his features. "That's not really a useful question, is it? Isn't it? Sometimes I wonder if I'd be happier now, living some ordinary life where my biggest worry was mortgage payments or what to cook for dinner, where nobody cared what I wore, or how I raised my children, or whether my marriage was everything it appeared to be. But you'd also never have had the platform to make the differences you've made," William pointed out. "The mental health initiatives, the early childhood development work, the way you've connected with people who needed to see someone in your position caring about their struggles." Catherine knew he was right, But the reminder of her public role only highlighted how complicated everything had become. Every charitable endeavor, every public appearance, every statement about causes she cared about was now filtered through multiple layers of palace protocol and political considerations. Sometimes she felt like she was performing a version of herself that had been focus grouped and media trained until it bore only a superficial resemblance to the person she'd been before. "I saw the children yesterday morning," she said, changing the subject, but not really. "George was practicing his French homework, and Charlotte was teaching Louis how to curtsy properly to his stuffed animals. They're so normal in some ways, but then I remember that their normal includes things like security briefings and understanding why they can't just go to the park without advanced planning. Are you worried about them?" "I'm worried about everything," Catherine admitted. "I'm worried about them, about us, about whether we're strong enough to handle whatever these tabloids are planning to throw at us. I'm worried that people see through our public appearances and know that we're not as perfectly united as we pretend to be." William reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns across her knuckles in a gesture that reminded her of their early dating days. "We've survived worse than this. Have we? Or have we just gotten better at pretending we've survived?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Outside, the sounds of London continued. Traffic, sirens, the distant voices of tourists and protesters and ordinary people going about their lives without considering the weight carried by the people living behind palace walls. Catherine thought about the girl she'd been at university, the one who had fallen in love with a prince without fully understanding what that would mean. That girl had been optimistic about her ability to navigate anything, confident that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. She wondered what that girl would think of the woman she'd become, whether she'd recognize her at all. The phone on the side table rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Amanda, calling to inform them that the first of the tabloid stories would be published within 48 hours. The preparation period was over. Soon, the world would be reading intimate details about their private struggles, and they would need to decide whether to respond or to maintain their traditional royal silence. As Catherine hung up the phone, she realized that whatever happened next would fundamentally change their relationship with the public and with each other. The carefully maintained balance between their private and public selves was about to be disrupted, and she wasn't sure they were prepared for the consequences. The first article appeared on a Tuesday morning, splashed across the front page of America's most widely read tabloid, with a headline that made Catherine's coffee grow cold in her hands. "Kate's Crisis. Exclusive messages reveal royal marriage in turmoil." Below it, a smaller subheading promised palace insiders expose the truth about William and Catherine's struggling relationship. Catherine sat in her private study, the newspaper spread across her desk like evidence at a crime scene. The article itself was a masterpiece of sensationalized journalism, weaving together out-of-context text messages, anonymous quotes from former staff members, and carefully selected photographs that made even their happiest public moments look strained and artificial. They had taken her frustrated message about Charlotte's school choice and presented it as evidence that she felt trapped and controlled by royal protocols. A casual comment about William working late had been twisted into a suggestion that he was avoiding confronting problems at home. What struck her most wasn't the obvious fabrications, but the way they had taken genuine moments of human struggle and stripped them of all context and compassion. The exhaustion she'd felt after a particularly challenging state visit became evidence of her inability to handle royal duties. Her close relationship with her mother was portrayed as inappropriate interference in palace decisions. Even her charity work was reframed as an attempt to create an independent identity separate from her husband's influence. William entered, carrying his own copy of the article along with several international newspapers that had already picked up the story. His expression was carefully controlled, but Catherine could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "How bad is it?" she asked, though the answer was written across his face. "Bad enough. The story's already been picked up by news outlets in 12 countries. Social media is exploding with commentary, and we're getting calls from every major newspaper asking for our response." William sat down across from her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Two people who had suddenly found themselves at the center of a media hurricane that felt far more personal and destructive than anything they'd experienced before. "There's more coming," William continued. "Amanda's sources suggest this is just the first installment. They're planning to release additional material throughout the week, building to some kind of major revelation they're saving for the weekend." Catherine felt her stomach drop. "What kind of revelation?" "We don't know yet. But they've been very specific about teasing that the final story will contain information that changes everything about how the public sees our marriage and our fitness for our future roles. The implications of that statement settled over Catherine like a heavy weight. She thought about all the private moments from their 15-year relationship that could be taken out of context and weaponized against them. Arguments they'd had during stressful periods, decisions they'd made that might look questionable to outside observers, moments of doubt or frustration that every married couple experienced, but that would take on different meanings when viewed through the lens of royal duty. The children, Catherine said suddenly, the thought hitting her like a physical blow. They're going to hear about this at school, aren't they? William's expression darkened further. We've already spoken to the school administrators. They're prepared to handle any questions or teasing the children might face, and we're considering whether it makes sense to keep them home for the rest of the week. The idea of their children being punished for their parents' struggles, of George, Charlotte, and Louis facing playground questions about whether their parents were getting divorced, made Catherine feel sick. She thought about Charlotte, so sensitive and intuitive, who would undoubtedly pick up on the tension at home, even if they tried to shield her from the specifics. She thought about George, already beginning to understand his future role and the weight it would bring, now having to process the idea that his parents' relationship was being dissected by millions of strangers. This isn't just about us anymore, Catherine said quietly. If we handle this wrong, it affects them for the rest of their lives. I know. William's voice was heavy with the responsibility they both felt. That's what makes this so much more complicated than a typical media crisis. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Clive Manning, the King's private secretary, whose presence at Kensington Palace always signified that matters had escalated beyond the level of normal royal business. Clive was a man in his early 60s, impeccably dressed and diplomatically careful in his choice of words, but Catherine could see concern etched in the lines around his eyes. Their Majesties have asked me to convey their support during this difficult period, Clive began, settling into the chair beside William. However, there are some practical matters we need to address regarding the potential impact of these stories on upcoming engagements. Catherine felt her heart sink further. They want us to cancel appearances. Not cancel necessarily, but perhaps postpone some of the higher-profile events scheduled for this month. The state dinner for the German Chancellor next week, for instance, or the joint appearance at the Commonwealth Day service. The suggestion felt like a public admission of guilt, even though Catherine understood the practical reasoning behind it. Royal events required months of planning and coordination, and any disruption caused by media speculation about their marriage could overshadow the important diplomatic and ceremonial purposes these occasions served. What about the Children's Charities visit on Friday? Catherine asked. That's been planned for months, and the organizations have been preparing. That one might be salvageable, Clive said carefully. It's lower profile, and your work with children has always been popular with the public. But we'd need to be prepared for increased media attention and potentially hostile questions. William ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Catherine recognized as a sign of deep frustration. So we're supposed to hide until this blows over? That doesn't seem like it sends the right message either. The alternative is to maintain your normal schedule and risk having every public appearance turn into a media circus, focused on your marriage rather than the work you're there to do, Clive pointed out. Catherine thought about the children's charity visit, an event she'd been genuinely excited about. She was scheduled to spend time with young people who'd overcome significant challenges, reading with them and discussing a new literacy program she'd been developing. The idea of canceling that because of tabloid speculation felt like letting the media manipulation win. I want to do the charity visit, she said firmly, but maybe William could handle some of the other events solo for now. William looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That might actually make things worse. If we start appearing separately, it feeds into the narrative that we're avoiding each other. But if we appear together and seem uncomfortable, that feeds into it too, Catherine pointed out. Maybe we're overthinking this. Maybe we should just tell the truth. Both William and Clive stared at her, as if she'd suggested something revolutionary. What kind of truth? William asked carefully. That marriage is hard work. That balancing public duty with private relationships requires constant effort. That we're human beings dealing with human challenges just like any other couple, but we're doing it while representing institutions that matter to millions of people. That's a very delicate message to craft, Clive said diplomatically. Is it? Or is it just honest? Catherine stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the photographers who had taken up permanent residence outside the palace gates since the story broke. Look at them. They're waiting for us to crack. To give them the dramatic confrontation or emotional breakdown that confirms whatever narrative they're trying to build. What if we refuse to play that game? William joined her at the window. And for a moment they stood side by side, watching the circus of media attention that had become their daily reality. "You're talking about being vulnerable in public," William said. "That's not something we're trained for. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe the training is part of what's creating the distance people are sensing." Before either William or Clive could respond, Catherine's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her blood run cold. The message was from Sarah, her former university flatmate, someone Catherine hadn't spoken to in over 2 years. The text was short but devastating. "I'm so sorry. I devastated the worst death. They offered me £50,000 for an interview. I said no, but I thought you should know how much money they're throwing around." Catherine showed the message to William, watching his expression grow increasingly grim as he read it. £50,000, he said quietly. "For one interview. That's probably on the lower end," Clive said grimly. "For the right story with the right details, they'd pay considerably more." Catherine thought about all the people from her past who might be approached with similar offers. University friends struggling with student loans, former colleagues from her brief career before marriage, distant acquaintances who might have observed something that could be twisted into a scandalous anecdote. The amount of money being offered represented life-changing sums for many ordinary people, and she couldn't blame anyone for being tempted. "How many people do you think they've approached?" she asked.
"Based on similar investigations in the past, probably dozens, possibly hundreds," Clive replied.
They cast a wide net and hope something useful comes back. The scope of the operation suddenly became clear to Catherine. This wasn't just opportunistic tabloid journalism. It was a coordinated attempt to gather as much damaging material as possible, from as many sources as possible, all designed to create a comprehensive narrative about their marriage and their fitness for their roles. "What happens if they succeed?" Catherine asked. "I mean, worst-case scenario. What if they actually managed to convince people that we're fundamentally unsuited for our positions?" Clive was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer a question that touched on some of the most sensitive aspects of constitutional monarchy. "In the immediate term, it would make your work more difficult and potentially less effective," he said finally. "Public trust is essential for the kind of diplomatic and charitable work you do. In the longer term, it could affect public opinion about the monarchy itself, particularly among younger people who are already questioning the relevance of hereditary institutions." "So the stakes are about more than just our privacy or our marriage," William said. "I'm afraid so. Whether fair or not, you've become symbols of the monarchy's ability to adapt and remain relevant in the modern world. Any perception that you're struggling to balance your personal and public lives raises questions about whether the institution itself can successfully navigate contemporary challenges." Catherine sat back down, feeling the full weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. It wasn't enough to be good parents, committed partners, and dedicated public servants. They also had to appear to be all of those things at all times, maintaining a perfect facade even when dealing with perfectly normal human struggles. "There's something else we need to consider," she said quietly. "What if some of what they're saying is actually true? Not the sensationalized version, but the underlying issues. What if we do need to make some changes in how we approach our relationship and our work?" William looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. It was a question that went to the heart of everything they'd been avoiding discussing, the elephant in the room that had been growing larger with each passing month. "You think we're in trouble," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think we're under more pressure than we've ever acknowledged, and I think we've gotten so good at performing our roles that we've forgotten how to just be ourselves with each other." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than anything the tabloids could publish. They had become so focused on being the perfect royal couple that they had lost track of being simply Catherine and William, two people who had once fallen in love without considering the weight that love would be asked to bear. The children's charity visit on Friday morning arrived like a lifeline Catherine hadn't realized she desperately needed. As her car pulled up to the community center in South London, she saw dozens of young faces pressed against the windows, their excitement untouched by the media storm that had dominated her world for the past week. These children didn't care about tabloid headlines or marriage speculation. They cared about the reading program she was launching and the books they would get to take home. Catherine had made the decision to attend alone, despite the palace's preference for joint appearances during times of crisis. William was handling a series of meetings with Commonwealth officials, and truthfully, they both needed some space to process everything that had happened since Tuesday. The separation felt natural rather than strategic, which was perhaps the most telling thing about their current state. Inside the community center, Catherine found herself genuinely smiling for the first time in days as 8-year-old Marcus showed her the story he'd written about a dragon who was afraid of flying. His enthusiasm was infectious, his pride in his work completely unaffected by any awareness of her personal struggles. For 45 minutes she sat cross-legged on colorful carpet squares, helping children sound out difficult words and listening to their creative interpretations of the stories they were reading. "My mum says you're very sad right now," said Lily, a precocious 6-year-old with pigtails and paint-stained fingers. "Are you better now?" Catherine paused, struck by the directness of the question. In the adult world, such concerns would be wrapped in diplomatic language and careful euphemisms, but Lily's innocent inquiry cut straight to the heart of what mattered. "Sometimes grown-ups go through difficult times," Catherine replied honestly. "But being here with all of you makes me feel much better." "That's good," Lily said matter-of-factly, then returned her attention to the picture book in her lap. The simple exchange stayed with Catherine throughout the rest of the visit. When the inevitable questions came from the gathered reporters outside, she found herself drawing on Lily's directness rather than falling back on practiced royal deflections. "Your Royal Highness, how are you and Prince William handling the recent media attention?" asked a journalist from the BBC. Catherine considered the question for a moment, remembering her conversation with William about the value of honesty versus the safety of traditional responses. "Like any family, we face challenges from time to time," she said finally. "What matters most to us is our commitment to each other, to our children, and to the work we're privileged to do on behalf of the people we serve." Today reminded me why that work is so important and so rewarding. It wasn't a dramatic revelation or a detailed rebuttal of specific claims, but it was genuine in a way that felt different from her usual carefully crafted statements. The reporters seemed momentarily surprised by her willingness to acknowledge challenges rather than pretending they didn't exist. That evening, Catherine returned to Kensington Palace to find William in the kitchen, attempting to help Charlotte with her mathematics homework, while Louis built elaborate structures with his dinner rather than eating it. The scene was so beautifully ordinary that Catherine felt a rush of affection for this life they had built together, imperfect and complicated though it might be. "How did the meetings go?" she asked, settling into the chair beside Charlotte and admiring her careful work with fractions. "Productive, actually," William replied, and Catherine heard something in his voice that suggested more than professional success. "We talked about some structural changes that might help reduce the pressure on all of us, more flexibility in scheduling, better boundaries between official duties and family time, maybe even some temporary adjustments to our public profile while we work through things." Catherine looked at him with surprise. "That sounds like a significant shift from the traditional approach." "Maybe the traditional approach isn't working for us right now," William said, echoing her own thoughts from earlier in the week. "Maybe we need to find our own way of doing this." After the children were settled for the night, Catherine and William found themselves back in the sitting room where their week of crisis had begun. But something had shifted in the atmosphere between them. The careful politeness that had characterized many of their interactions lately had given way to something more honest, if not entirely comfortable. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier this week," William began. "About us performing our roles so well that we forgot how to be ourselves with each other. And I think you're right. I think somewhere along the way, I started treating our marriage like another official duty that needed to be managed and maintained rather than a relationship that needed to be nurtured and enjoyed." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness but from relief at hearing him acknowledge something she'd been feeling for months. "I've been doing the same thing, making sure we looked right together instead of making sure we felt right together." "The tabloids aren't entirely wrong about the pressure I've been under," William continued. "Father has been pushing for more aggressive modernization of the monarchy, and there are constant discussions about our public image and effectiveness. Sometimes it feels like every decision we make is being evaluated for its impact on the institution, rather than its impact on our family. And I've been so focused on proving that I belong in this world that I've lost track of who I actually am in it," Catherine added. "I became so concerned with being the perfect princess that I stopped being myself." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the weight of their admissions settling between them. Outside, the photographers had finally given up their vigil for the night, leaving the palace grounds unusually quiet. "What do we do now?" Catherine asked. "I think we start with the truth," William said. "Not the whole truth shared with the entire world, but the truth between us about what we want this marriage and this life to look like. Even if that means making changes that people don't expect or approve of, especially then." The conversation continued late into the night, ranging over topics they hadn't discussed openly in months. They talked about their hopes for their children's futures, their concerns about the changing nature of public life, their individual dreams that had gotten lost in the shuffle of royal obligations. They disagreed on some things, found common ground on others, and began to sketch out a vision for their relationship that prioritized their connection as a couple alongside their duties as public figures. The final tabloid story was published 3 days later, and while it contained some embarrassing revelations about arguments they'd had during a stressful period the previous year, the impact felt muted compared to what Catherine had been dreading. Perhaps it was because they had already begun addressing some of the underlying issues the stories had exploited, or perhaps it was because they had stopped trying to pretend that their marriage existed in some perfect royal bubble immune to ordinary human struggles. The public response was more nuanced than Catherine had expected. While some commentators used the stories as ammunition for broader criticism of the monarchy, others seemed to appreciate the glimpse of humanity behind the royal facade. Social media was filled with supportive messages from people sharing their own relationship challenges and expressing admiration for a couple willing to work through difficulties rather than pretending they didn't exist. Most surprisingly, the crisis seemed to strengthen rather than weaken public support for their charitable work. Applications for the early childhood development programs Catherine championed increased dramatically, and William's environmental initiatives received renewed attention and funding. It was as if their willingness to acknowledge imperfection had made them more relatable rather than less effective as public figures. The real test came a month later, during their first major joint appearance since the tabloid stories had run their course. They were attending the annual Commonwealth Day service at Westminster Abbey, an event that would be watched by millions and analyzed by every royal correspondent in the British media. As they walked up the Abbey's ancient nave, Catherine felt the familiar flutter of nerves that accompanied high-profile public appearances. But this time, the nervousness was different. Instead of worrying about projecting an image of perfect unity, she was focused on simply being present with William, supporting each other through an event that mattered to them both. During the service, when William reached over and squeezed her hand during a particularly moving musical performance, the gesture felt genuine rather than performative. When she smiled at something amusing whispered by the Archbishop, her expression was unstudied and natural. They were still playing their public roles, but they were doing so as themselves rather than as carefully constructed versions of themselves. The media coverage that followed was largely positive, but more importantly, it focused on their work and the significance of the Commonwealth relationships they were there to celebrate, rather than speculation about their marriage. They had found a way to be publicly themselves without sacrificing their effectiveness as representatives of the institution they served. That evening, as Catherine tucked Charlotte into bed, her daughter asked the question that had been weighing on Catherine's mind for weeks. "Mummy, are you and Daddy going to get divorced like my friend Sophie's parents did?" Catherine smoothed Charlotte's hair back from her forehead, choosing her words carefully. "Daddy and I are working very hard to make sure our family stays strong and happy. Sometimes that means having difficult conversations and making changes to how we do things. But it doesn't mean we're giving up on each other." "Good," Charlotte said sleepily. "I like our family the way it is." "So do I, sweetheart. So do I, sweetheart." Later that night, Catherine stood at the same bedroom window where she'd watched the joggers in Hyde Park weeks earlier when this crisis had begun. The park was empty now, shrouded in darkness, but somehow it looked more welcoming than it had that morning when she'd envied the freedom of the people running through it. She had learned something important during the past month about the nature of freedom itself. True freedom didn't mean escaping from responsibility or obligation. It meant finding authentic ways to meet those responsibilities while remaining true to yourself. The joggers in the park might have seemed free from the outside, but everyone carried their own form of constraints and expectations. The trick was learning to work within your particular set of circumstances in a way that honored both your commitments and your deepest sense of self. William joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind in a gesture that reminded her of their early days together. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Catherine leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The tabloid crisis had been painful and invasive, but it had also forced them to confront issues in their relationship that might have festered and grown worse if left unaddressed. "About us." "No," she said finally. "About letting things get so complicated that we almost lost sight of what mattered most." "Maybe, but not about us. Even knowing what it costs to be in this life, especially knowing what it costs, because now I also know what it's worth." Outside, London continued its ancient rhythm of life and change, challenge and adaptation, And inside the palace walls, two people who had learned to carry the weight of centuries-old traditions were discovering that the real strength of any institution lay not in its ability to remain unchanged, but in its capacity to evolve while preserving what was truly essential.
Their fairy tale had never been perfect, Catherine realized, but it was real, and it was theirs, and perhaps that was more valuable than perfection after all.